We naturally tell stories, and so as people are still, I think we might be over the people still making their way, but just to express what it's like to naturally tell stories, I'm going to just start off with a very quick warm-up game, if I may, which I call the Wizard. And it works like this. In a moment, I'm going to say once upon a time, and you're going to say the next word. Oh, one. Yeah, you can't have two. You can only have one, all right? Okay? And so, yeah, there is often the next word, though I have had other next words. You might like to imagine what those could be. I mean, I've worked in some of the more difficult parts of our city, so I've had some really interesting choice words at this point, okay? Often two, okay? But, and then I'm going to point like this, and we're just going to see how far we get with a story. Because that's what we do as people. We create, hiya. Come on. No. This is, no. Though I am a volunteer youth worker. That wasn't mentioned this morning as well. So no, due to. So once upon a time.
There is
a smelly.
Ah.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
A smelly girl. Okay. Oh, so she's smelly, and she's gone walking in country lanes. Sometimes when I'm doing this, I will say full stop, which means you have to now.
Amazingly.
Oh, we got an adverb in the room. Way. Oh, so amazingly.
She was alone.
Oh. Can you feel the suspense building up? I can. I'm actually a bit worried for her at the moment. But you're saved, because we do need to crack on with the next bit of the workshop. But I wonder where we'd have gone. You'll have to find out what happens to her. And, I'll tell you something. She's not going to buy any deodorant products in my Tesco's at the moment, but that's another. We're going to just look at stories, and on your handout, have you now got both handouts? Has everybody got both handouts? If there are spares, can you wave? On your handout, you've got what I'm telling you. And when you see the handout, if you're still getting the handout, when you see it, spares, anybody still needing one? Yeah. Right, John, you are now in charge of handouts. Anybody comes in late, you're handing them a handout. Can you just keep an eye on the door? If anybody comes in late, you've got to run and take it to them. Avoiding the camera. Thank you, John. I'm telling you 4 things about stories, and you're going to read them in a moment. You're going to think, really? I've signed up to do that? Like, stating the flipping obvious, okay? Story sequence events. There are different types of events in those sequences. Within the sequence, there's a plot, and different readers get different readings. It is like stating the obvious to some extent. But I think as people schooled in the ways of storying, we sometimes are like the fish that asks the question, what is water? And we sometimes need to think, what is this stuff that we swim around, and how does it actually work? And so what we'll actually be doing in the next 50 minutes, okay? In the next 50 minutes, we will be doing quite a deep dive, actually, into analysing stories and how they work and how they tick. But also, bottom line is, some of this stuff, it's just different ways of picking apart the workings of a story. Some years ago, when I was first doing, I used to write on this stuff when I was teaching. I stopped when I stopped teaching because I said, I can't be writing about stuff I'm not doing. But I remember likening it all to a cardboard dog. I got a cardboard dog where you could turn a handle and it nodded its head like that and its tail went like that, okay, as you did it. And what I did, I found one basically in a shop somewhere, and then the fellow said, well, there's a kit, you can make it. It was a shop in York which had all these different kits, and so I got the kit, and being a primary school teacher, so that we could all have a little go. And what we were doing was finding the inner workings. And there's this whole discipline called poetics. It's a part of literary theory. But we don't need to worry about that. We just need to know that there's a way of digging into stories and finding out what actually is going on. So that, and here's the ultimate goal, with our children and young people, we have effective ways of reading again, and maybe again, so that people start finding something in the story that makes them say, what's that about? What's going on there? And you know, my goal would be if some of the folks we work with find something where you don't know the answer. That's when we're doing the Faith of Stories. Okay. So, first one, story sequence events. You might know the story about how God goes up to the angel Gabriel and says, I've had this great idea. I've been working on it for quite some time. It's this unit of 24 hours, and it's marked by the rising of the sun, and then we'll have the sun setting as well, and coming up and going down again. And I'll arrange for the earth to spin on its axis to mark this thing. I've been working on it, so I'm absolutely exhausted. And Gabriel says, so what are you going to do next? And God says, I think I'll call it a day. Okay. Just for a moment, let's have a look at some of the events in one of the stories that you've been handed. I don't think we need to read it out loud. If you want to just take a look at Mark chapter 6, verses 45 to 52, I've handed it to you as photocopied from a Bible, because can I just say, I am a passionate advocate when we are doing Bible stories with children of them actually holding either an electronic but just them holding the actual thing and finding their way to it. That's another story for another time, another thing. But just have a quiet read, if you would. Mark 6, verses 45 to 52. You'll probably know the story. Right. Whoever's got the pen, show me the pen. This is really primary teacher, isn't it? Pop the top on the pen. You got to do it sometimes, haven't you? I tell you, you know. Children's and youth workers are by far harder to control than a pile of 6-year-olds in my experience, okay? Just take a look at your scraps of paper and just see, firstly, what have you left out? What have you missed out? And also, have you got roughly the span of the story? Or is most of your stuff from the start of the story or the end of the story? Or is there a crunch point that you've just gone for? And then also, can you shuffle them where you're sat into some sort of order? Can you actually get them into an order? You might have, your first piece of paper might have been the wind dies down, but that's not going first, is it? That's going, yeah. Now, we could have taken about, actually, if we were doing it in a really rich way, we could at least have taken 15 minutes on that. We could possibly have taken 20 minutes as a room of adults. But one of the things I'm suggesting is that straight away we've moved beyond just reading the story. Have I got any other primary teachers from the 80s in the room? From the 80s? No, the hands went down. Yeah. Some of you might remember the Southgate report, which looked into the teaching of reading. Why children were entering into this wholly enriched domain we call reading. And one of my favourite findings in the Southgate report was the little lad who was asked, so why do you think you are learning to read? And his reply was, so I can stop. What we're doing is trying to find engaging ways of restarting. So can I just ask, did you notice any big gaps in what you ended up with? Are you surprised by anything in the story? Did you notice something you haven't noticed before in the story? Anybody? Anything from the story? Anything arise? Where did you go for first? What did you get first?
We didn't have anything later on in the story. We got as far as Jesus walked on water.
Right, and you've just left him there, haven't you? You've just left him there, okay? Of course, had we done, and the other thing, can I just say, what we didn't do, which I would do with children, I would do with you if we had time, we'd have another look at the reading in a mo, and we'd look again. And I'd say something like, is there anything that puzzles you? For example, have any of you got verse 48, the last bit of verse 48? You can look at your readings now. Have any of you got that on there? Those wonderful words. I love it. He intended to pass them by. He's intending to pass them by. What's that about? It doesn't say he's pretending to intend to pass them by. He actually is fully intentional at that point, according to the reading, on just passing them by. And interesting enough, when people read this story, they sometimes think that they get confused with the storm on the lake, which is elsewhere in Mark. But actually, it's just hard going. They're pushing against the wind. Now, we start then to ask ourselves, so not what is the meaning of this story, but what's that saying to us? What's that about? And you know, for some of us, the answer might be, I haven't got a clue. But I like that. I can live with that in a gospel story. That's our first one. The first one of our 4 things where you're going to think, gosh, he's stating the obvious. Story sequence events. And sometimes we miss out on the events. Here's where we do the deep dive bit. This is going to be quite complex, the next bit. Don't worry too much about it. I'll try and unpick it. But there are different types of events in those sequences. And I've put some quotes on there so you can see there, faced with an individual event, we can look at some further distinctions. And I'm going to make 3. There's an action and a happening. There's a durative or a punctual. We are going to use some nice technical terminology. And there's a hinge point or a catalyzer. Action or a happening, really important when looking at gospel stories, I think. What is done and what is done to? What do people like Jesus and people like disciples actually do? I mean, the disciples go on ahead. Yes, he makes them do it, but they do it. And Jesus, yes, he prays, but can you see something that happens to them? Just have a look at your reading. What happens to them? Yeah. Yeah, so their fear happens. Yeah, okay, they get this frightening experience. I would suggest that actually the hard going, the wind and the waves, you can almost imagine it, you know. What it doesn't say clearly is whether the wind stopping is an action or a happening, whether that just happens or whether that's caused. That's left open to us. And I think that's left open to us for a reason, because Mark's gospel is a journey of you discovering who this strange character is called Jesus. You actually journey with them through this thing. But that's the difference in an action and a happening. First one, the degree to which a character makes something happen or to which it happens to them. When we approach the readings of Easter, bear that difference in mind. You will not come up with a clear answer, but the degree to which it is done or done to some extent, is the whole Easter story captured in a really interesting question. Second one, durative or punctual. That's basically that some events are, pa-chum, they just happen, pa-chum, they just happen. Okay, so walking towards them. They cry out. That's durative. Whereas the wind, that is just ongoing. The wind just goes on and on and on. So the walking towards them, that would be a punctual one. But the wind, like the hunger of a people on a hillside, like a crowd in a trial, they're almost like the backdrop when we're trying to paint the picture of the story. The wind is just going on and on and on. It's a bit like my elder brother, actually, but that's another story. And then the third one, hinge points and catalyzers. In any story, there are things that really matter, and there are things that don't matter as much, where you could write them out of the story, you wouldn't put them in a summary, but you'd still have the story, really. You'd still be able to pass the story on. Now, you've got to be careful with these. You've got to be really careful, because, and this is where I always veer off the Bible when I'm doing this sort of thing, because I just get excited about stories. You've got to be really careful, because in a lot of stories, those things, we think that they're just fluffy frills to the side of the story. How lovely, how lovely. But actually, oh my goodness, are they important? But we don't know about it until later on in the story. When Bruce Willis receives his lighter, his cigarette lighter, in Die Hard 2. Those of you familiar with it, it is a Christmas film, those of you familiar with it will know how important that lighter is. And if you don't, watch it. Okay, I heartily recommend, as well as reading the Bible, watch Die Hard 2. It was on, I think it's on every Thursday night on I can see it. It's one of those ones up and down the channels thing. It's like Jurassic Park, you know? Right. Yeah, oh well, yeah. But you know about the cigarette lighter? The scuba tank in Jaws, when they all fall over the deck and Richard Dreyfuss tells the police chief Brody off, those could blow up and things like that. Think what happens later. I've got a couple of personal favourites. I do like when Sid puts the match in Woody's holster because he can't set the rocket off in Toy Story. You forget about it until a little later in the story. My personal favourite, the complete and total obsession that E.T. has with a pot plant. For so much of that film, it looks like it's just a nice frill to the film, that it's just a sort of interest. It could be anything. But remember what happens when everybody thinks he's dead. Remember what Elliot sees when he just, Anyway, you could think of your own, I'm sure, okay? In fact, that's your homework, okay? Think of your own, watch your own, find your own. Some things are really, really important to the story. Some things the story could not do without. Other things, really, if we lost those, they wouldn't matter. The note under the door in Jude the Obscure, that's going to matter forever. But the weather, to be honest, sometimes Thomas Hardy goes on a bit too much about it in my book, but that's the difference between nuclei and catalyzer. And I've given you a nice meaty quote on there about it. Here's what I want you to do, though. And I'm sorry if we have run out of readings, and I'm not in a place where I can run and copy. But if you can see a copy of Mark 1, verses 35 to 45, which I've handed out, just go through that if you would, and ask yourself, have we got anybody who is completely gospelless? No? I can hand it back. Mark 1, well, actually, have a look on there, if you would, because we're going to do a little bit of dancing around the page at some point, okay? So, Mark 1, 35 to 45. Now, have a look at this one, and just for a moment ask yourself, what are the real nuclei there? What are the turning points in that story? What are the things that, if they were written out, that story would be wrecked? And what are the things where you're thinking, actually, maybe we could do without that? If I was summarising the story, I wouldn't need that. Just have a quiet read and have a think. So I got a bunch of kids. Imagine I got a bunch of kids and I'm wanting to do this story with them, and we've read it. But I want to read it again. That's boring. That is just boring. And I as a 7-year-old, I acutely remember being 7 years old. It was my 7 to 8 was the year my mum says she wore a track to the school, basically, because I was so much trouble at school as a 7 to 8. That was probably the high spot in primary. In secondary, I had another good few flashpoints. But in primary, that's when I really went off the rails. Did it marvellously. And so I can really remember being bored. So how do we get it? So here's what we got. In this room, there are people with slips of card, and on those slips of card are the story. I'm going to ask those people to come out the front, not to look at one another's slips of card. I do not care how you line up at the front, but can you make a line along here, please? You have the easiest job of the whole of the next bit of the session. You don't have to do any work. In fact, you mustn't do any work. No looking at each other. No, no. Because otherwise, they won't do what they're meant to do. Here's what's going to happen. In a moment, they're going to read the story, but it's jumbled up because I haven't put them in order as they came out the front. What you've got to do is listen to it. And, by the way, can I just say, put your readings down. They'll only help you, and we don't want to help you. We don't want to make it easy for you, okay? So just listen, and as you're listening, you can't say anything. But once they finish their read-through, you can ask anybody to move around, okay? And folks, for the purposes of us not knowing one another's names, and me, I'm terrible at forgetting names, do you mind if we just refer to you as, would that be purple, maroon? Maroon, yeah. So the fella in the maroon, okay, is that all right? And things. So you can be as rude as you want to about telling them, okay. But we're going to move you up and down, or if you want to do it just by saying, right, you need to go there, okay. Even better, okay. You aren't allowed to do anything. Bearing in mind, all we're doing here is just looking at the fact that stories give an ordered sequence to events. Hopefully in a way that would make a 7-year-old think, right, hang on, I'm listening to this story, even though I've heard it before.
He answered, let us go on to the neighbouring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do. And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons.
Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I do choose, be made clean.
A leper came to Jesus begging him, and kneeling he said to him, If you choose, you can make me clean.
In the morning, while it was still very dark, Jesus got up and went out into a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, Everyone is searching for you.
After sternly warning him, he sent him away at once, saying to him, See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them.
But when he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the word, But he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the word, so that Jesus could no longer go into a town openly, but stayed out in the country, and people came to him from every quarter.
Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean.
Right, quickly. Who do you want to move? Because you're going to lose track of it soon. Okay, who are you moving? Right, okay. Yeah, come on, keep them moving. Yeah, did you get an ending? Right. Okay. Okay. Any other shuffles? Right. You read lovely and clearly. This time you can rush your reading because we don't want to make it too easy for them. Okay, so nice quick reads, and we'll just rattle down the line. Listen again. Can I just say, I've done this a number. You're still wondering, are you? Were you looking and about to move? Yeah, you are in completely the wrong place apparently. Okay, all right. So where to? Somewhere down here. So look, we're going to go up there, but not at the very end. Think so? Next one on. Let's try next one on. Can I just say, I've done this activity with all sorts of groups. Usually there needs to be another read before the final read, okay? So yeah, here we go.
In the morning, while it was still very dark, Jesus got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, Everyone is searching for you.
A leper came to Jesus begging him, and kneeling he said to him, If you choose, you can make me clean.
Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I do choose, be made clean.
After sternly warning him, he sent him away at once, saying to him, See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them.
He answered, Let us go on to the neighbouring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do. And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons.
It's not me, it's him. He's the one in the wrong place. Don't look at me. Tell him, yeah.
Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean.
But he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the word, so that Jesus could no longer go into town openly, but stayed out in the country, and people came to him from every quarter.
Right, tell the fellow in the maroon what he needs to learn. Yeah. They're putting you back where you were before, almost, aren't they? I know. It's them, not me. Okay, it's not me, it's them, yeah. Anybody else? Now, you're either being really offensive or there's something going on back there, okay? Yeah. Yeah? Do you think you've got it? If so, we'll have the last one. Can I just say, if you have, that is pretty good going. Can I just say, while we're doing this as well, be asking that question, what's essential in the story? If you do this at any point with your young people or your children, can I just make one request? Don't get them doing the reading bit. And if you are short of 7 children's workers, Sunday school teachers, whatever term you use, COGS leaders in Christchurch. Okay, if you're short of 7, then this is where the people of God get off their backsides and do something for the young people, because whoever's standing out there in the church, they need to come through and they need to do this bit for you. And in my experience, actually, people really like doing that sort of thing, coming through and doing that. But the kids get to order the adults around. That's the really important thing, okay? Here we go.
In the morning, while it was still very dark, Jesus got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you."
He answered, "Let us go on to the neighbouring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons.
Everybody was giving you a little nod of approval there. Well done. Well done. Yeah. Well done. Yeah.
A leper came to Jesus, begging him, and kneeling, he said to him, "If you choose, you can make me clean."
Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I do choose, be made clean."
I'm going to ask you to read that again and just listen. If you were to cut bits from the story, or if you were to say that's a hinge point, think that sort of thought. I am playing a little game with it as well. I apologise, because there's a bit of a twist to it.
Again, sorry, yeah. Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I do choose, be made clean."
Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean.
After sternly warning him, he sent him away at once, saying to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them."
But he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the word, so that Jesus could no longer go into a town openly, but stayed out in the country, and people came to him from every quarter.
Get in. Fantastic. You've got it. Well done. Can I just ask you, sorry, you'll be sitting down in a moment, was there anything in there where you were thinking, when you were looking through, that's a really hingy point, and is that a frill? Always watch out. Some of those frills aren't frills. Some of them are Bruce Willis's lighter, for want of a better description. But any distinctions you were making there? Yeah, he reached out. What would you say? Yeah, well, interesting enough, also, a lot of his healings are verbal in the Gospel of Mark. And sometimes that can sound, you've landed on exactly the right one for the right reason, I think. But let's hear them to say, if you can I hear? Yeah, just listen to the first line of this one.
Let us go on to the neighbouring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do.
And just listen to this one for the first bit.
But he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the word, so that Jesus could no longer go into a town openly.
Jesus' mission action plan, Jesus' strategy just got scuppered. And the reason it got scuppered is possibly, there's one of two reasons. You take whichever response you want. I'm jumping to point 4. Okay? You take whichever point you want, whichever you want. But it could be, like lots of people think, Jesus just became very famous, and wherever he went, he was crowded out of places. That doesn't actually happen in the Gospel of Mark. What happens is that set up, that is scuppered, and in between, this thing happens.
Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I do choose, be made clean."
So he's touched a leper. He is now ritually unclean. And it could be that is why, hang on a minute. Yes, that is why we have that lovely phrase, moved with pity, which in the original Greek is a real, he snorted with sort of an anger, with a passion, with a real... I'm putting it to you that what's happened here is that Jesus, who had a strategy there, sees something happening there that's going to scupper it down there. But let's give these folks a big round of applause for standing at the front for so long, okay? The main thing being, and I've put down there a list of ways of playing with this idea, and I've just given some very simple ones, which is this. Catch every event. Don't miss a trick in a story. Watch out for, I don't know what was going on when he was making out he was going to walk past them. But that idea rattles around in my head because I don't know, actually. To be honest, if I thought I knew why, it wouldn't rattle quite as well. Oh, and split events into smaller units as well. I am very keen, when we're doing this sort of stuff, that we don't use fancy stuff and that we just use scrappy bits of paper. And if I'm doing it with bits of paper, I will do with kids things like this. I will say, right, look, there we go. Jesus heals leper. I'm going to try and make the leper kneel down and, yeah, okay, Jesus heals leper, okay? Right, kids, I want everybody to do their own. You can scribble your own, but then I want you to do this. Do a bubble that side and a bubble that side. And then I want you to take that event and split it into the two main bits. You've got 30 seconds to do it. I'd give them longer. Very quickly, just start doing your own. You can even use letters or just know what you do, but scribble it on the side of your page there with your pen, just for a moment, very quickly. Because then I'm going to ask you to do something even more annoying. I'm going to get more annoying than that. Just do your own. You don't need to with your group here, but yeah, just have a go at your own. While you're doing it, am I all right saying something while you're doing it, yeah? The whole thing is, these stories that we read, they make up these sequences that then break up into small sequences, you know, and it's not always orderly. Shakespeare's is orderly. Shakespeare, you get 5 clean acts, and they tend to be the same length, because that's how long the candles could last before they needed to replace the candles in a Shakespearean theatre. So 5 tidy chunks to it. But in the gospel, you get some, the story we just had of the leper. Did we actually have one story there? Or did we have 2 stories? Or did we have 2 micro stories that joined together in a macro story? The story of Jesus being found, the story of the leper healing him, possibly even 3, if we put another 3rd one here. Jesus is now scuppered, can't go into towns. And it's about saying to kids, right, how many of you, whatever you put there, or whatever you've put there, I want you to take that event, and guess what I'm going to ask you to do now? I'm going to ask you to do that again. And break it into 2 separate bits there. Because we tend to tell a story in one big Jesus healed a leper. But actually, the leper asks to be healed. They have their conversation about not going and telling people. I could split that into 2 bits because Jesus tells him not to, and he goes and does that. In fact, I could do 3 there. Do you get the idea? Keep splitting the story into its bit. In actual fact, yeah.
Are those 2 bubbles like before and after?
Yeah, I suppose if this was my event here, this would be the first half and the second half. And then going down the line, this would be the first half and the second half of that one. And who knows what sort of small detail I'd get into. But actually, do you notice how lovingly, possibly because of what's going to happen in Jesus' mission, how Mark sells us in intricate detail what he does in that moment of contact, which I think is what you're saying about the stretching out of the hand is so important. Anyway, okay. Actually, a gospel is itself one big sequence of these smaller stories telling a bigger story. So the Gospel of Mark, which actually looks like that, is one beautiful big pattern of a story, actually. And I can actually read on it. My eyesight hasn't gone that far. You won't be able to from there, I know. But that's what Mark looks like. I sometimes show this to people when I say those words, which folks at Christchurch are sick of me saying because I say it too often. I urge you every so often to sit down and grab a gospel and don't get up till you've finished it. Cup of tea, couple of crunch creams, just read it right through. The sweep of the story. You get it from reading it right through. If you read this right through, you get the fact that Jesus mills around in the countryside. He can't go into cities anymore. And he keeps milling around until this point here, when he starts getting northern and further north. All the best things happen up north, don't they? He starts getting further north, and it is in Caesarea Philippi, in the northernmost part of the story, that he says, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ." And at that point, he turns around, has an argument with Peter, gets transfigured, and from then on, he's saying, "I'm on my way to Jerusalem," and they're saying, "Don't do it." It's exactly halfway through the story that starts all the way down to that point at the end, where a centurion stands in front of the cross as the curtain is split in two and says, surely this was the Son of God, which nicely bookends a gospel that starts in a baptism where the heavens are split in two and a voice says, surely this is my Son. Interesting enough, here it's done by the voice you'd expect to say it. Over here, it's done by the person who in Mark's time would have been persecuting the church and who would be one of the most hated characters you could have in a story. Anyway, that's the sort of thing you do when you get this idea of these big sweepy sequences. But when it comes to children, splitting events into smaller units and playing with the sequence any way we can, every time we do that, we are effectively just rehearsing, retelling, rediscovering the story. Whether we do it with the paper scraps, where we're saying, keep adding. How many of you are going to get, if we carried on the earlier activity, 10 scraps of paper? And are you going to get them lined up nicely at the end of it? I wonder, you know? Oh, and another one. Just looking at... Actually, no, I'll do that in a moment. Let me just move on to sequence and say a bit about sequence in a moment and time. But looking at a story and saying to children, right, you've had the story. Now, everybody, you think without saying anything to the person, what was the main moment in that story for you? There is never a wrong or a right answer to this. What was the main moment in that story for you? And then we could do this in various ways. I could say, right, you tell me yours, and as you say it, I could put you at the front, and we could then put somebody either side of you. You got one before or after that one. We haven't got it. Yeah, you get the idea, okay? And we could end up with everybody telling the story around a circle. And there is nothing to be ashamed about by being the child who finds the one that nobody else is saying. In fact, you are possibly the literary theorist of the future. Let's give them a round of applause. But we make just finding different ways of doing the same job, which is basically joining in with the retelling of the story and finding different ways of retelling it. And you've got to be careful with that as well, because sometimes the stories are not told in a perfect sequence. There's flashbacks, flash forwards, things that tell us of something that's going to come later, because he had not yet with Jesus quite a lot, and things that tell us something that somebody had been thinking before the story started. Anybody who's an EastEnders fan will be familiar with this from the recent 35th anniversary, where every day of that week we were taken back to the start of the wretched boat trip, and we had to replay the events, only to go back again in like a Groundhog Day. No? Oh, if you want to get into the study of stories, I would recommend lots of books on literary theory, but above all of it, watch EastEnders. They absolutely know what they're doing out there, okay? Right, so, yeah, just working with sequencing as well. It's about finding different ways of working with sequencing by using varied materials to do it and splitting up events into bits and asking, what would you say is the main event in that story? What's the one that really matters? I did this once with a Christmas story. I was in a school and we had 30 kids in my class. It was Ellesmere School, which is now demolished. If the council hadn't demolished it, the children would have. It was a really lively place to work, actually. Really lively. But I remember saying to them, right, we're all going to now, we've had the Christmas story, okay? Right? And so, and they weren't, so many of them were not familiar with the Christmas story. So you've heard it. You all go off with a bit of paper. This is not art. It was actually a literacy lesson. So quickly, just draw a quick picture of what you think is the main bit of the story, the bit that matters most to you, bring it back, and then we're going to put them all in a big row to see how well we got the story. Again, it just saves me having to retell it. But a quick activity, and off they went, kids coming back with sheep, kids coming back with kings, kids coming back, yeah. And along comes Ben Roy, who, he still lives in the area. He has grown up to be the most handsome young man, and he is a real credit to the school, I believe, okay? But back then, Ben Roy was one of those kids who sort of wobbled as he was telling you things, you know, yeah, okay, he comes after a piece of paper, and there it is, a picture of a man with a beard and a big car. That's lovely, Ben Roy. I said, what's that? He said, that's Jesus, man with the beard. That's the taxi. And I'd said about, you know, Christians think Jesus is still important for them. So I thought, so I didn't say, you know, what the heck's going on here, Ben Roy? You know, I said, yeah, that's great. So sort of Jesus in contemporary life, really, and still with people. And yeah, he gave me a funny look, as if I hadn't quite got it. Yeah, but other things, we were due to do other things, so we put it at the end of the story. 3 o'clock the following morning, in my slight half-awake moments, remembering the day that had gone before, my wife can actually remember I just laughed out loud, okay? Because I realized what had happened. I had told that class that Mary and Joseph had gone to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, and they'd gone there because of the taxes. If you remember, the Romans had ordered all those taxes, and Venroy had actually drawn me one with Jesus stood right next to it. What's the main event of the story for you? Time is against us, but can I just say, if you were to do this with the story of the Gadarene demoniac in Mark 5, it is a fascinating one to do it with, because it is one of those stories in which the flashing back and flashing forward isn't common in the Bible, but in that story, you really struggle to make the sequence. I have some slips here, actually, which if anyone wants to stay around in their lunch hour and have a go, you can. But actually, getting the order of events in that story is not as easy as getting the order in which they are told. Because actually there's one reference in there to Jesus saying, come out of the man, but we're not clear when it actually happened. Could be that it happened when he was crossing the lake. Could even be, given that Jesus just goes, heals him and goes back again, that the only reason he went there was because he wanted to heal that person. Could even be that he was famous amongst fishermen on Jesus' side of the lake. Who knows? That's the nature of stories. That's why we play with them. But let's move on to the last of the points, which is that, actually, I've lost an activity here. I'm going to come back to, yeah. No, I will come back to that one. We may not have time to do it in full, but if we do, I'll do it in full with you. So, my third one, which is within the sequence, there is plot. And this is really the third one we work on. The fourth one, I've cheated. I said this morning, I'm terrible at remembering to do the 4 things if I've said I'm going to do 4 things. So by giving them to you at the start, you're responsible for them now, not me. But the fourth one, really, I hope you'll have seen throughout what we're doing here, the more you unpick the story, the more you create holes in the story, you find gaps in the story, you find places where you're going to respond, where what happens when he reaches out his hand may mean something different to one person to another, where what happens when, what is he doing? Going to pass them by? What's going on there? That's why we have stories, because they'll all create different responses. And those events get put in a sequence, and within the sequence, you get this plot, this lovely idea of plot, which is best described as being like the string that holds the beads together. I've given you one of my favourite quotes. I've not given you too much from all the literary theory stuff, because really you're better off just having fun with stories. But one of the best quotes, E.M. Forster, that wonderful writer of Room with a View and Passage to India and Morris, he talked about it all being about causality. That stories were about a narrative of events, but the emphasis was on this thing called causality. And he gave this lovely distinction. He said, the king died, and then the queen died. That's a story. The king died, and then the queen died of grief. That's a plot. One thing has caused another. One thing has led to another. And it's actually something we create as readers, actually. We see it. I showed you this morning that. Do you remember that 2-framed cartoon that is on your handout from this morning? You create the connection between the two. We create that. It's something we see as readers. But it's where stories come alive. If you think about it, the entire Narnia saga happens because of the English weather. It's raining. You're stuck indoors. So what do? You go hide in a wardrobe. And thank God you do, because look what we all got as a result of one kid hiding in the wardrobe because it was raining outside. Just in terms of picking up on things to look at in stories, the beginning and endings of stories, really important about looking at where we do our beginnings and our endings. And I do like the idea that sometimes we read the bit before and the bit after, so we find how the story fits into the bits either side of it. Bishop Pete, for those of you who've ever sat with him or been, when he's doing Bible teaching, he has an absolute hatred of small bits of Bible being read. So if you're ever going to have a short reading with him, take a cushion along, because he does these lovely sweeps across stories, and it's important because in doing that we make the connection of the start of the story with the end of the story. Just want to suggest some very quick ways of playing with that idea. And one of them is to constantly be asking why in a story. Why this, why that, why the other. And if I was to scribble that on a bit of paper, and as I say, I like the scribbles, I'd be saying to my folks I'm working with, think of it as being like a chain. Actually, scribble one down very quickly. Put 3 links in it. Scribble one down on your handout now, very quickly. I always run out of time, as Mike pointed out this morning. So if I was to say the wind died down by here, or I could just draw a boat on a calm sea, what caused that? Why did that happen? And what caused that? Or what caused that? If I was to put in this box here, Jesus, and he's not going into towns from that Mark 1 story. What caused that? Could you actually scribble a little doodle in there that caused that? Because I am the annoying teacher. You know what I'm going to ask you once you've done that, don't you? What caused that? And you know, if you do that, what am I going to ask you then? What caused that one? I could instead have done my 4 or 5, or however many links you want, and in this box here, in this one here, had Jesus healing the leper. And I could say what caused that and what happened as a result of that. But it's about finding the thread that links those pearls together. And one way of rereading a story, rather than just saying we're going to go through it again, is to read the ending and work backwards. What caused that? What caused that? And what caused that? It's what some of you were doing 20 minutes ago with E.T.'s pot plant. If you remembered, it's suddenly coming alive in that moment and trying to work out, so why was that important to what happens next? How does that lead to the most wonderful bike chase ever? And what causes it? Why is it important from earlier in the story? Okay, so it's playing with the links. Let me just say something very quickly as well about looking at the shapes of stories, and just introduce one other, which for some reason, this is one that I find just works really well with colleagues when we're looking at stories, and I've always found it works with children. If I was to take our earlier story, and can I just say, I would not do 4 or 5 activities on the one story, all within the space of 50 minutes. So let's imagine we've just read it. That story of the healing of the leper. And funnily enough, the line I want is the very line that was picked up over here, okay? That's the line in my notes. Jesus reaches out. What happened before it? What happened after it? I don't care what order you put it in, but can you remember something that happened before, something that happened after? Can you remember 2 things that happened before, 2 things that happened after? If you do, we'll be close to you getting your lunch. Whisper to the person next to you. Can you remember 2 before, 2 after? Friends, can I just say what I would do at this point? I'm seeing more and more people going past now, so I'm going to release you for lunch in a moment. What I would do at this point is I would ask you to shout them out, and I would just use one-word summaries to get them up there. That means I'd have to listen to what you say and try and pick out my one word in there, or you might tell me what your one word is. But we could spend a bit of time sorting events into what happens before, what happens after. We could do that with stories like the feeding of the 5,000. And depending on what you put in the middle there, whether you put Jesus getting out of the boat, which looks like it's the start of the story, but it actually isn't. There's a bit before it. Never mind what that is now. You can look at that afterwards. But we could also play the game of, if somebody says to me, Jesus touches the leper, I go with my pen to the board and I say to you, I want you to make noises that guide me as to where I should write that. So somebody says Jesus touches the leper. I say, right, I'm going to note that down. How close or how far was it from the middle line here in terms of the story? And as I put my pen out, you might, you see, not happy, right? Not happy, all right? Okay, and what do you say? Yeah. Hi, yeah, it's Bruce Forsyth. Go for it, okay? Hi, exactly. Done well, this activity does turn into a bit of a Brucey moment, and no classroom should ever be without one of those on a roughly weekly basis. Colleagues, can I just thank you and say we're out of time. There are other things we could be doing with stories. What I would say is this. Most of the stuff we've done today does not come from the hallowed halls of RE teaching, wonderful the world though that is, that I inhabit quite fully. It comes from literacy teaching, and it comes from some of the techniques that we use to pick apart stories, or that we put together. I worked for some years on the teaching of literacy, and it was all about just finding ways of picking that story apart so that you enjoy it all the more, not so you kill it. Never kill a story, never ever kill a story. Picking it apart to kill it is terrible. And if there's one avenue to follow, it's those literacy activities, and if you Google online, there's all sorts of different ones that you can do. Corridors of advice, drama activities with stories, hot seating. When you find a good quality literacy activity, you have also found a fantastic activity, very probably, for the teaching of the gospel. The only other one I will mention is I put on there Jani Hauke's article on your resources about the shapes of plots and the shapes of stories. We could have done a whole other thing on that, but time is against us. It also means I haven't got time for questions, but I'm not leaving this room, so you can come and ask if you've got any questions about anything. But is that all right? Is that sort of what you're expecting? If you came into this room expecting first aid, then you've been in the wrong room for the past hour, and people will suffer as a result. But otherwise, can I thank you for bearing with having to run around and do all sorts of things? Thank you.